What I'm going to talk to you guys about tonight is a summary of significant civil rights amendments, acts, and legislation over the period of time that the United States has been in existence, starting from the Civil War. And I think that we will find a lot of interesting information that you may not have thought of before. So let me go ahead and start by letting you know, I can't tell if I like my new blender or not. It keeps giving me mixed results.
Knee slap.
Yep, just like my video quality so far. Okay. Now, President Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, as the nation approached its third year of a bloody civil war. And this is the beginning of what we did as a nation to try and get rid of the evil of slavery. And most of the slides I'm going to be showing you are going to show Republicans actually supporting these amendments and this legislation to a greater degree than the Democrats, which you would not believe if you listen to the Black Lives Matter people who are now trashing our streets and setting up autonomous zones and so forth. But the facts matter. So I think that it is important that we go ahead and discuss some of them. You know, sometimes I think 53% of America is stupid. I'm just glad I'm part of the other 54%. Oh, come on. I got to get something for that. All right. So the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution abolished slavery and involuntary servitude except as a punishment for a crime. Once again, it was President Abraham Lincoln who proposed that. The Senate passed the amendment by a vote of 38-6. And now look at that. 100% of the Republicans supported it, only 25% of the Democrats. Because you remember, the Democrats liked slaves. They were in the South. They were the ones who beat them. They were the ones who robbed them. They were the ones who slept with the women who were slaves down there. So they weren't too happy about giving any sort of approval to having slaves be abolished and having slavery be. Now, we fought the war. We won the war. How did we get any of them to vote for this? Well, because we kept federal troops down in the South and didn't allow them to come back into the Union until they voted for this amendment, until it got passed. So if anybody actually refused to vote for this amendment, they had federal troops there to not let them have any type of jurisdiction over their own states. That's how we got it done. Force. Force is sometimes the answer. There'll be those who tell you it's never the answer. They have not studied history. Okay, on the left-hand side, you see Lyman Trumbull, another Republican. So Thaddeus Stevens, you can come over on this side if you want. He is also a Republican. They passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 that legislated all people in the United States were U.S. citizens and had certain inalienable rights, including the right to contracts, own property, sue in court, and enjoy the full protection of the federal law. This is after we won the war. The person who is against this is over on the right-hand side. You can tell all the Republicans I put on the left looking to the right, and all of the Democrats are on the right looking to the left. He vetoed this, and once again, we overrid it. Now, I'd love to tell you exactly what the Republican support was, but it's very tough to go find the exact counts on some of these because Google is run by people who don't want you to know how Republicans have supported the civil rights of African Americans to a greater extent than Democrats. So it took me 8 hours just to put together this presentation, and still I couldn't find every piece of data that I wanted. Next slide. 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including former slaves. Now, this gentleman on the left, who's very intense, is Thaddeus Stevens. He's a Republican who sponsored the amendment, another Republican. The Senate passed the amendment with 100% of Republican support. 0% Democrats voted aye. And 100% of the Republicans in the House voted for this amendment. 0 of the Democrats. Just another example of how civil rights would be impossible if it weren't for Republicans who are pushing the agenda. The next slide shows on the left-hand corner, you guys recognize this gentleman? He is Ulysses S. Grant. He was in charge of the efforts to win the Civil War. And after he won the Civil War, he made sure the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution was passed that prohibited the federal government in each state from denying the citizen the right to vote. Because you see, after we won the war, they proceeded to put in poll taxes and Jim Crow laws and actual lynching by the KKK of any blacks who actually thought that they now had the right to exist as an equal human being in the United States. And who was doing all the lynching? The Democrats. Remember, they were the ones in the South who were fighting the Civil War and lost. But they weren't willing to acknowledge that they'd lost. They continued to fight. They just did it under white sheets in the middle of the night. So the 15th Amendment got passed by 98% of Republicans, 0% of the Democrats in the House, 89% of the Republicans in the Senate, 0% of the Democrats in the Senate. Are we seeing a pattern here? I'm seeing a pattern. All right, this gentleman, Senator Charles Sumner, Republican, he's on the left-hand side looking right. He passes or pushes the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which legislated all people born in the United States were U.S. citizens and had certain inalienable rights, the right to make contracts, full protection of federal law, and so forth. The House passes it by a vote of 162. The Senate passes it. President U.S. Grant, a Republican, signs it. And here's where everything went downhill, because the Supreme Court of the United States decided it was unconstitutional infringement by the federal government of state and private property rights by an 8-1 decision. We can't blame this on Republicans. We can't blame it on Democrats. It was an 8-1 decision by the Supreme Court, which is a perfect example of how the Supreme Court can make boneheaded decisions that have to be overrun in future, more intelligent times. Something to remember after their latest case. So what happened between then and the next 100 years? Well, everything reverted back to the Jim Crow laws and the poll taxes and everything else because the North got tired of having to send down federal troops to try and fix the problem. So then what comes around is Truman. Truman decides, and he is a Democrat, and he is not that very good at hiding his prejudices. In fact, he talked to his wife in a letter and he said, I think one man's just as good as another so long as he's honest and decent and not an N-word. I can't actually say the N-word or I would be canceled for life. But he says, not an N-word or a Chinaman. Uncle Will says that the Lord made a white man from dust, an N-word from mud, and then threw what was left and it came down a Chinaman. He hates Chinese, he hates Japs, and so do I. It is race prejudice, I guess, but I'm strongly of the opinion that Negroes ought to be in Africa, yellow men in Asia, and white men in Europe and America. This is a politician who is our president. This is far worse and more inflammatory than anything Trump has ever said in his entire life. And everybody loves, on the civil rights side, Truman. Why? Because he integrated, under Executive Order 9981, the federal workforce and the armed forces. So despite the fact that he was privately thinking that they're inferior, his actions in a public sphere rescued him from oblivion and being called a racist. Everyone wants to forget what he said and admire what he did, which is fine. I agree with that. Actions are louder than words. Supreme Court 1954 ruled, in the case of Brown versus Board of Education, that racial segregation was unconstitutional. This overruled Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. And all of a sudden, the whole race war started to explode again because the South could no longer do what they were doing. So there was a new Civil Rights Act passed by a Republican, which is Dwight Eisenhower, with 90% of Republican support in the House, 100% of Republicans, about 53 to 62% of Democrats. So once again, the Republicans were more interested in civil rights than the Democrats were. And it was possible to do this because the Supreme Court was now not going to make unconstitutional what the Republicans were actually pushing. Now comes the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is mostly all the Democrats want to remember, because this was passed by LBJ after JFK died. And JFK is the liberal icon that everybody loves, and because he died, he's valued at much higher than he actually was before his death. And LBJ, who is also a racist, as you can tell from some of the things I've written there, and I don't have to go ahead and repeat them because you guys know how to read, but he used the death of JFK to push the Democrats into supporting something they absolutely did not want to support. So you see 80% Republican support for this legislation, 61% Democrat, 82% Republican support, 69% Democrat. And the president, Lyndon Johnson, who is an avowed racist, signs the law, signs the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and gets all the credit. That's all the civil rights people want to remember, is that a Democrat was the president at the time this was passed, despite the fact that he had to do all sorts of shenanigans to get it passed, break all the rules in the Senate and the House to overcome the people who were in charge of various committees who were going to just filibuster it to death. And the people who were in charge of those committees were all Democrats. Now we get to the Civil Rights Fair Housing Act of 1868, also signed by Lyndon Johnson, with 91% Republican support versus 71% in the Senate, 78% Republican support versus 71% in the House. Meanwhile, he's basically putting Thurgood Marshall on the Supreme Court and making derogatory, negative statements behind his back. Once again, what you say versus what you do matters way more. If only that was the same standard for Republican presidents. So what happens after this? After the Republicans stand up for civil rights for blacks over all of these years, now you see, well, the blacks are all Republicans, right? Because we've been on their side since the time of slavery, right? No, 80 to 90% of them are Democrats, only 20% are Republicans. How do you explain that? How do you explain it? Well, you can't explain it rationally based on what I have just shown, so there's got to be something else. There's going to have to be a second speech where I dig even more, waste another 8 hours of my time to try and figure out how this irrational result can come from us being so nice on the Republican side towards the blacks. Is it a double standard? Maybe. But then again, after years and years of looking at the differences between Republicans and Democrats, I understand that if it wasn't for double standards, the Democrats would have no standards at all. Fellow Toastmasters.